When people think of Paul McCartney, they picture the charming Beatle, the voice behind Hey Jude, the guy who's always smiling and making people happy. But behind that friendly image is a man who's much more complicated, emotional, and careful about who he trusts. He's been hurt by betrayal. For decades, fans thought the Beatles' biggest fights were about music, fame, or money. But hardly anyone knew that Paul carried something darker, a deep personal dislike toward one person who broke his trust and left a wound he never forgot. In this video, we're going to uncover the untold story of that fight, the name on McCartney's private list of people he doesn't like, the betrayal that changed the Beatles forever, and the quiet anger that stayed with him long after everything ended. Let's dive in. Number 1. John Lennon. Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote more than 200 songs together, creating the soundtrack of a whole generation. But by the mid-1960s, their friendship started to break apart. Lennon didn't like the clean, perfect image Paul was building. While Paul got frustrated with John's messy life and Yoko Ono always being around. After their manager, Brian Epstein, died, the Beatles fell apart. Paul wanted to keep the band together. John wanted to be free. In the recording studio, Paul's need for everything to be perfect clashed with John's rebellious attitude. Even George Harrison briefly quit because of all the fighting. When the Beatles finally broke up, Paul sued to end their company, and John saw it as the ultimate backstab. Lennon fought back with a song called How Do You Sleep, making fun of Paul, singing, "The only thing you done was yesterday." Paul later answered back with Too Many People, a subtle insult aimed at John and Yoko. But before they could make up and be friends again, tragedy ended everything. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot in New York, and Paul was left with the one thing no friendship can survive: words that came too late. Number 2, Michael Jackson. In the early 1980s, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson had a real friendship. Two musical giants from different worlds who became close. Paul saw Michael like a younger brother, while Michael looked up to Paul as a legend. One day, Paul shared some advice. The real secret to success was owning song copyrights. He explained how buying other writers' music collections gave him money for years. But what Paul meant as friendly advice, Michael took as an opportunity. In 1985, when ATV Music, the company that owned most of the Beatles' songs, went up for sale, Jackson bought it for $47.5 million. For McCartney, it felt like a betrayal. The student had used the teacher's lesson to take his legacy. Their friendship never got better. Even when Michael later had money problems, he never sold the rights back, instead partnering with Sony. Years later, Paul admitted the pain never fully went away. "I thought we were friends," he said quietly, but Michael turned it into a business deal. Number 3, Mark David Chapman. On a cold December night in 1980, John Lennon was coming home to the Dakota Building when Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old fan-turned-stalker, shot him 4 times, killing him right away. Just hours earlier, Lennon had signed an autograph for him. When the news reached Paul McCartney, he was in shock. Surrounded by reporters outside a studio, he mumbled, "It's a drag." Those 3 words would haunt him for years, seen by many as cold and uncaring, when in truth they came from pure shock. Privately, Paul was heartbroken. He later said, "Mark Chapman didn't just kill John, he stole a piece of the Beatles' soul." For decades, McCartney refused to say Chapman's name, calling him only a coward and a crazy psycho. Every Beatles tribute reminded him that the 4 of them would never stand together again. What hurt most was knowing that just weeks before, he and John had started talking again, even discussing getting back together. But on December 8th, that hope disappeared forever. McCartney carried that pain for life. And while Chapman pulled the trigger, there was another name behind the Beatles' collapse, one Paul has never forgiven. Number 4, George Harrison. Paul McCartney and George Harrison often fought in the studio. Paul's need for perfection pushed everyone to their limits, especially George, who got tired of being told exactly how to play every note. During the Let It Be sessions, McCartney's constant instructions finally pushed George over the edge. He quietly put down his guitar, said, "See you around the clubs," and walked out. It wasn't the first time his ideas had been ignored or changed, and to him it felt like being embarrassed. Though they stayed polite in public, the tension stuck around. George once said bluntly, "Working with Paul is like having your hands tied." Even after the breakup, legal fights over Apple Corps kept them divided. Paul wanted control. George wanted freedom. In the end, McCartney's relentless drive turned a loyal bandmate into a quiet rebel. But the real blow to the Beatles would come from outside the studio. Number 5, Yoko Ono. Before 1968, the Beatles' recording studio was a sacred space, a creative sanctuary where only music mattered. But everything changed when John Lennon began bringing Yoko Ono to every session. Her constant presence changed the group's delicate chemistry. Yoko was bold, outspoken, and fiercely protective of John. She had strong opinions about everything, and that didn't sit well with Paul McCartney, a perfectionist who valued focus and order. He saw her comments during songwriting and recording as unwelcome interference. "I don't resent Yoko for being with John," Paul once admitted. "But I hate the way things changed once she appeared." Many historians point to this moment as the beginning of the slow fracture in the Lennon-McCartney partnership. When the Beatles eventually fell apart, Paul often implied that Yoko played a key role. In interviews, he said John was never the same after meeting her, that every decision, musical or personal, seemed to flow through her. And Yoko, for her part, didn't hold back either. She saw her bond with Lennon not just as love, but as an artistic alliance, a union meant to push boundaries and reshape culture. "John was the real creative soul," she once said pointedly, adding that Paul only excelled at writing catchy melodies. The remark stung. For McCartney, who had spent years proving himself as Lennon's equal, it felt like a public slap in the face. Their feud deepened after John's death. The old songwriting credit, Lennon-McCartney, had always been a symbol of partnership, regardless of who wrote the song. But Paul wanted to revise the order for tracks he primarily composed like Yesterday to McCartney-Lennon. Yoko refused, seeing it as an attempt to diminish John's legacy. "She wants to rewrite history to benefit her and John," Paul once said. "But I can't let that happen." Yoko fired back, dismissing Paul's solo music as simplistic and empty entertainment. She even went so far as to call him the least important Beatle in a 1981 Rolling Stone poll, a jab that cut deeply. By the late 1990s, time had softened their public hostility. When McCartney worked on the Beatles anthology project and reissued old recordings, the two managed a polite truce, exchanging letters, avoiding conflict, but never truly trusting each other again. Years later, Paul summed it up quietly. "I don't hate Yoko, but if it weren't for her, the Beatles might have lasted a few more years." Yet, even after that storm, another wound waited to open. This time not from Yoko, but from within the band itself, when a quiet younger brother finally rose in protest and left Paul facing one of the most painful betrayals of his career. Number 6, Alan Klein. After manager Brian Epstein's sudden death in 1967, the Beatles plunged into chaos. They were musical geniuses, but when it came to business, none knew how to steer the growing empire. Apple Films, Apple Corp., the studio, the boutique, all losing money fast. That's when Alan Klein appeared, presenting himself as their savior. He was a shrewd businessman who had managed the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, known for fighting record labels on behalf of artists. He promised to make the Beatles wealthier than ever. But from the start, Paul McCartney didn't trust him. He thought Klein was slick, manipulative, and smelled of lies. Paul wanted the band to hire Eastman and Eastman, his wife Linda's family firm. But John, George, and Ringo sided with Klein. Lennon even admired his bluntness. In 1969, all three signed with Klein. Paul refused. From that moment on, he was cut out of major decisions. Klein began firing employees and cutting projects, briefly boosting profits, but Paul was convinced he was stealing from them. By the end of 1970, McCartney had enough. He sued the other Beatles, not only to dissolve the band, but to escape Klein's control. The world called him the traitor who broke up the Beatles, yet time proved him right. Years later, Klein was exposed for fraud and forced to repay the band over $800,000. Lennon, Harrison, and Starr reluctantly admitted Paul had been right, but by then, the Beatles were gone. McCartney later called Alan Klein the man who killed the Beatles, not with music, but with money. Number 7, Frank Sinatra. At first, there was no animosity between Paul McCartney and Frank Sinatra. Paul admired Sinatra's smooth voice, his charm, and the sophistication he brought to music, a symbol of a golden era he genuinely respected. For a while, despite their differences in generation and style, there was mutual appreciation between the two legends. But that harmony didn't last. Sinatra began taking shots at rock and roll, dismissing it as a pile of garbage for rebellious kids. For McCartney, one of the men who helped spark that revolution, the remark felt like a direct insult. It wasn't just a jab at a genre. It was an attack on everything the Beatles represented. Things worsened when Sinatra mocked Yesterday, calling it the saddest song ever written, and even parodying its melody during a live performance. Paul was crushed, and just when the wound began to heal, another slight followed. During one concert, Sinatra performed George Harrison's Something and introduced it to the crowd as the best love song Lennon and McCartney ever wrote. It might have sounded like a compliment, but to Paul, it felt like another dismissal of George's authorship and of the Beatles' individuality as artists. From that point on, McCartney understood that Sinatra would never truly see the Beatles as equals, only as noisy newcomers who disrupted his world of polished ballads. They never exchanged harsh words face to face, but the silent tension between them lingered. It was more than a feud. It was a quiet battle between two eras, Sinatra's old-school elegance and McCartney's youthful rebellion, leaving behind a subtle but permanent scar. Number 8. Phil Spector. By 1970, the Beatles were already crumbling from within. The Get Back sessions, Paul McCartney's attempt to bring the band back to their simple live-in-the-studio roots, had dissolved into arguments, tension, and creative exhaustion. When their new manager, Alan Klein, whom Paul already mistrusted, hired producer Phil Spector to fix the recordings, it was the final blow. Spector was known for his bombastic wall of sound, an avalanche of orchestration, echo, and emotion that filled every inch of a song. But that was the exact opposite of what Paul wanted. His ballad, The Long and Winding Road, was meant to be quiet and heartfelt. A fragile confession, not a cinematic storm. Instead, Spector flooded it with strings, brass, and a women's choir, burying Paul's voice beneath layers of sound. To make matters worse, he even erased some of McCartney's original vocals to make room for his own additions. When Paul heard the finished version, he was livid. He immediately sent a letter to Klein and Spector demanding, "Get the strings, the brass, the choir, and all that noisy stuff off." It was his way of saying, "You violated my song." But his protest was ignored. In May 1970, Let It Be was released with Spector's overwrought mix intact. The album was a commercial success, but for Paul, it felt like a personal defeat. He saw it as proof that the Beatles were no longer a band, just four men pulled apart by conflicting visions. Even longtime producer George Martin was appalled, remarking bitterly, "This album should read produced by George Martin and ruined by Phil Spector." Spector, as always, refused to apologize. "Paul's been performing my version for decades," he bragged later. He even won an Oscar for Let It Be. If he wants a fight, he's picked the wrong man. But McCartney never forgot. Over 3 decades later, he finally set the record straight. In 2003, he released Let It Be Naked, the album stripped of Spector's embellishments, restored to its raw, emotional core. When the long and winding road finally played again as Paul had intended, just piano, voice, and silence, it wasn't merely a remix. It was a reckoning, a quiet declaration to the world. This music is mine, and no one will ever distort it again. Why McCartney never revealed his list? Why has Paul McCartney stayed silent about the people he disliked? It's not out of fear, it's wisdom. He knows the cost. To millions, he's the friendly Beatle, the voice of peace and love. Admitting to grudges would shatter that image instantly. The world wouldn't see the gentle artist anymore, only a bitter old man clinging to the past. In Britain, public resentment is seen as undignified, and McCartney understands that his image is as valuable as his music. After a lifetime in the spotlight, he's learned how one angry quote could explode into headlines. McCartney slams Lennon, feud reignites. So he stays quiet, not out of weakness, but out of self-preservation. The Beatles aren't just a band, they're a symbol of harmony. McCartney knows that if he ever attacked Lennon, Yoko, or Harrison, that myth would crumble. Instead, he lets the music speak. Too Many People was his subtle jab at John. Lennon's How Do You Sleep was the reply. Their feud played out in melodies, not words. Many of Paul's rivals are tied to people he loves. Yoko was John's wife, and John, despite everything, was his brother. To attack her would reopen wounds for millions, and he knows history can be cruel. If he ever said, "I hate Sinatra," or "I despise Spector," the world might forget Let It Be and remember only his anger. Now, in his 80s, McCartney chooses grace over grudges. He walks on stage smiling, still singing about love. Silence for him is the highest form of forgiveness. In the end, maybe the only list he keeps isn't of enemies, but of lessons learned. And that's why decades later, he still sings, still shines, and still reminds the world that love outlasts everything.